My talk today grows out of research for the large Musée des Beaux-Arts de Montréal exhibition that is being organized by Jacques Desrochers with myself as co-curator. The exhibition and the accompanying multi-authored catalog will examine the work and the achievements of Montreal's Beaver Hall group of artists, situating the group within the larger context of the city's visual, literary, dramatic, and musical cultures, as well as its socioeconomic and political life during the years roughly from the end of the First World War until the 1930s. Although it is difficult to make general statements about the Beaver Hall group, it would be accurate to say that for the most part, the artists carved out identities for themselves by employing modernist approaches to color, draftsmanship, and composition to portray modernist subjects, urban and suburban views, figure painting, and portraiture, as opposed to what has been described as the anti-modernism of the group of seven's sparsely populated and wilderness landscapes. The 24 artists who have at various points over the years been linked with Beaver Hall range from those who were well known and respected during the 1920s and whose reputations remain strong: Emily Coonan, Adrien and Henri Hébert, Prudence Heward, Edwin Holgate, A.Y. Jackson, Mabel Lockerbie, Kathleen Morris, and Anne Savage, among various others. But it also includes those, notably Hal Ross Paragard and Adam Sheriff Scott, whose luster has dimmed significantly since the 1920s. It also includes figures figures whose interest as research subjects has only recently become more than desultory, figures like Nora Collier, Sarah Robertson, and Ethel Seath, and Thurston Topham, as well as those whose work is today extremely challenging to find and whose lives are difficult to reconstruct, people like James Crockert, Jean de Crèvecoeur, Daryl Morrissey, Sybil Robertson, and Scoop Torrance. The Beaver Hall group was founded in 1920, the same year as the Group of Seven. It was a short-lived collective about which we know discouragingly little in terms of firm detail. In the autumn of 1920, Randolph Houghton, Mabel May, Lilias Torrance, and possibly Edwin Holgate rented studio and gallery space in a now vanished house at 305 Beaver Hall Hill in an area where several other artists also had studios, just north of Vieux-Montréal and on the eastern edge of what is today Montreal's downtown. At the same time, A.Y. Jackson was shuttling between Toronto and his native Montreal, encouraging his friends here to follow the example of the Group of Seven by uniting to occupy a position from which they could attract attention and promote contemporary Canadian art. As Jackson wrote the next year to the National Gallery's director, Eric Brown, on the subject of prospects for artists in Montreal, quote, "The influence of the Art Association and the Arts Club has always been to curb enthusiasm and vitality. The mild stuff always hung well, praised and often bought. The intenser stuff skied, sniffed at, and seldom purchased. Now," he wrote, regarding the opening of the Beaver Hall Group's first exhibition in January 1921, "there is a chance for establishing a higher standard." According to the Montreal Gazette critic who reviewed that exhibition, "Individual expression is the aim of this group, although the artists do not promise anything extreme. Indeed, the paintings do not tax credulity." In an interview 62 years later, Edwin Holgate recalled that Beaver Hall had no officers, we had no manifestos. It was a question of getting studios, working space, keeping prices down, because none of us was flush. And this was one way of cooperating, grouping together, taking over a house instead of little bits of individual driblets here and there. However, other than this interest in pooling their financial resources, along with their commitment to modernism, Beaver Hall artists indeed lacked the shared ideological goals about art and nationhood that drove the Group of Seven. Although Jackson confided in 1921 to the Montreal Gazette that there was, quote, "every indication that a distinctly national note may be struck in Canadian art as a result of that exhibition," he also stressed that the group's principal purpose was, quote, "to give artists the assurance that he can paint what he feels with utter disregard for what has hitherto been considered requisite to the acceptance of work at the recognized art exhibitions in Canadian centres." The ad hoc character of Beaver Hall accounts for the large number of artists that have come to be associated with it, as well as for the paucity of its activities and the brevity of its lifespan. It held only 2 exhibitions that showcased the overall membership, the first in January 1921, the second in January 1922, along with 2 other documented events, a solo show of the work of one of its members, Adrien Hébert, and a display of a small oil sketches made by Anne Savage's students at Montreal's Commercial and Technical High School. There were most likely other small exhibitions mounted in the gallery space at 305 Beaver Hall Hill, but if so, they seem to have attracted no press attention at all. Things might have been different had A.Y. Jackson been around. Jackson was the only member who was even remotely effective as a spokesperson for the group, at least in its early days. But by 1922, he was busy spending most of his time on the lower north shore of the St. Lawrence River and the north shore of Lake Superior and in Toronto, where he was proselytizing with great effectiveness on behalf of the nascent group of 7 instead. In any case, at no point during the 6 decades after the January 1922 exhibition does the name Beaver Hall appear to have been mentioned anywhere in any of the Montreal newspapers. That 60-year silence paralleled the lack of primary documentation produced by the group. As Edwin Holgate phrased it 5 decades after the dissolution of Beaver Hall, quote, "We just gravitated toward each other automatically. I mean, somebody showed a fresh attitude of some sort or other, a personalized style, and we just naturally got together and cooperated. It wasn't even a planned thing. It was an automatic thing." No membership lists survive, if indeed they ever existed at all, and even artists who participated in the 2 major exhibitions could be ambiguous about their own status, a sure sign that casual formlessness was a defining feature of Beaver Hall. As one of many examples of this, consider the fact that years later, Thurston Topham, who had showed work in both the 1921 and the 1922 exhibitions, named the Arts Club of Montreal as the only art society to which he had ever belonged. The lack of clarity about the membership and activities of Beaver Hall goes a long way towards accounting for the historiography of the group. Of particular relevance to the theme of this conference is the fact that although some 14 men and 14 women have at one point or another been linked to the group, ever since the mid-1960s, the membership has been repeatedly discussed as consisting predominantly or exclusively of women. This in itself, of course, is a major anomaly within the history of art and art historical writing, where women have routinely been marginalized. As Carol Duncan and others have pointed out, that marginalization has tended to be most prevalent in cases where, as was the case with Beaver Hall, the stakes involve the development of modernism as a self-consciously cutting-edge project, a project that usually manifests a strong bias towards the masculine. In this regard, it's worth mentioning that in the first months of Beaver Hall's existence, A.Y. Jackson did propose a masculine basis for the group, in part by attributing its founding principally to Edwin Holgate. Holgate was certainly an important player in the Montreal art scene, and he was very interested in Beaver Hall, but it's also the case that he left for a prolonged trip in Europe almost immediately when the group came into existence, and that much of the original work in setting up the group was in fact done by Mabel May and Lilius Torrance. Jackson also observed that 7 former soldiers who had recently returned from World War I in France were, quote, very strong in the group. This bias towards the male was watered down in the 1921 and the 1922 exhibition reviews, however, where women and men were given equal prominence. But at the same time, the group fell off the critical radar, as Jackson increasingly devoted his time to the group of 7, and Beaver Hall failed to find a comparably enthusiastic spokesperson. Thus, Beaver Hall is not even mentioned by name in Newton McTavish's 1925 book, The Fine Arts in Canada, even though that book was published very shortly after the group's last known surfacing. McTavish made a single cryptic 15-word reference to what he called the Montreal School, which he described as having, quote, a less definite association than the group of 7. This almost certainly was a telegraphic reference to Beaver Hall. However, although McTavish named no members in this sentence fragment, in another chapter, the one he devoted exclusively to Canadian women artists, he included 3 painters who were associated with Beaver Hall, although McTavish doesn't actually make that connection: Emily Coonan, Mabel May, and Regina Sidon. The next year, 1926, Fred Hauser, in his unrelentingly butch monograph, A Canadian Art Movement, deified the group of 7, which he compared ever so briefly to Beaver Hall. However, Hauser named as members of the group a total of 8 artists, 4 men and 4 women: Lilias Torrance Newton, Sarah Robertson, Anne Savage, and Mabel May. It was Jacques Desrochers who reminded me about the fleeting and rather unexpected Beaver Hall reference in Hauser's book. 17 years after Hauser, in 1943, William Colgate's Canadian Art, 1820 to 1940, failed entirely to mention the group, but did cite in other contexts 3 of its women members: Mabel May, Lilias Torrance Newton, and Anne Savage again. In 1966, J. Russell Harper's landmark publication, Painting in Canada, A History, resuscitated the group, albeit in a minor way. Harper devoted half a page to Beaver Hall, but in that short space he named 8 artists, 5 of them women. Harper's modest 1966 revival of the Beaver Hall name seems to have encouraged Nora McCullough, who worked at the National Gallery's Extension Services Department, to organize that same year, 1966, a traveling exhibition titled The Beaver Hall Group. McCullough's project, the first in 44 years to structure an exhibition around the group, featured the work of 10 artists, all of them women. McCullough's exhibition signaled a sea change in both the visibility and the gendering of the group. The first edition of Dennis Reed's A Concise History of Canadian Painting, published in 1973, dedicates 3 pages to the group, and only 3 of the 9 artists discussed are men: Jackson, Holgate, and Randolph Houghton. Subsequent exhibitions and publications that have included the word Beaver Hall in their title followed McCullough's lead even more thoroughly. A modest 1982 show for the Sir George Williams Art Galleries here at Concordia was titled Women Painters of the Beaver Hall Group. Toronto's Caspar Gallery staged Beaver Hall Hill Group in 1991, simultaneously getting the name of the group wrong, and numbering only 1 man, Edwin Holgate, among the 9 artists who were represented. Similarly, although a 2007 exhibition at Montreal's Walter Klinkoff Gallery was given the moniker the Beaver Hall Group, the show featured 10 artists, slightly more than a third of the total membership, and all of the 10 were women. In addition, the only 2 monographs published to date on Beaver Hall, by Barbara Meadowcroft and Evelyn Walters in 1999 and 2005 respectively, likewise deal solely with women artists. To this day, students in my courses react with surprise, occasionally even skepticism, when informed that as many men as women were involved with the group, and that 50% more men than women participated in its 2 mixed members exhibitions in 21 and 22. How are we to account for this phenomenon? One vital explanation has to do with the blossoming of feminist scholarship, of course, over the last 4 decades. Among the cornerstone books and exhibition catalogues that addressed Linda Nauckland's 1971 question, "Why have there been no great women artists?" were Anne Sutherland Harris and Nauckland's Women Artists, 1550 to 1950 in 1978, and the 2 anthologies edited by Norma Brudi and Mary D. Garrard, Feminism and Art History, Questioning the Litany in 1982, and The Expanding Discourse, Feminism and Art History 10 years later. In Canada, well before the creation of the Canadian Women Artists History Initiative, the recuperation of otherwise undocumented careers was pursued by Joyce Siemens, Natalie Lutzky, Rosemarie Arbour, and other scholars. Anne Savage was the subject of a major solo show at the Musée des Beaux-Arts de Montréal in 1981, the same year that the Agnes Etherington Art Centre held a retrospective exhibition of Lilias Torrance Newton's portraits, and a mere 5 years before the Agnes Etherington staged Natalie Lutzky's major retrospective of Prudence Heward's paintings. The momentum was thus established for exploring other Beaver Hall women whose careers were still poorly documented, a momentum propelled by the clear public interest that attendance in these exhibitions indicated. I think it's also important that the ensuing examination of these artists fed a growing demand not only for a more inclusive and analytical approach in intellectual and cultural analysis, but also for the physical availability of work by artists other than those who had long been staples of the secondary art market in this country. Indeed, the Beaver Hall women have become blue-chip participants in the Canadian art auction scene for the last few years, and often outstrip previous gold standard artists such as Cornelius Krieghoff and members of the Group of Seven. After almost a century of neglect following the last 1922 exhibition, the Beaver Hall group was essentially reinvented and given an unmistakable gender identity during the years and decades after 1966. A second factor in the gendering of the Beaver Hall group derives from the increasing attention that has been paid to the history of institutions, including artist groups, in the historiography of art history. Janice Helland, writing several years ago, eloquently argued that the question of belonging for women artists has often focused not in terms of formal memberships in art groups, in which gendered language and glass ceilings have been less than welcoming, but rather in terms of networks of personal friendships. Indeed, Barbara Meadowcroft acknowledged the importance of Helen's work when she titled her 1999 monograph, Painting Friends, the Beaver Hall Women Painters. In her perceptive criticisms of a previous draft of this paper, Anne Whitelaw reminded me that the very term friendship tends to be gendered, with male artists more likely to have professional terminology applied to their relationships with one another. The Group of Seven's members and supporters, for example, were much likelier to be referred to as colleagues or co-workers or participants in a professional network, rather than just friends. During the 1920s in Montreal, however, friendship was the warp and weft of a support system that was essential for women. Both the Pen and Pencil Club and the Arts Club were male preserves, as was the Group of Seven in Toronto. Organizations such as these invited women to participate in their annual exhibitions, but membership per se was rarely an option, a problem that was only partially addressed by the opposing membership policy of the Women's Art Society. Women artists necessarily relied upon their friends for professional advice, support, criticism, and validation. In this regard, it's interesting to note the extent to which the idea of group, with its opportunities for close collaborative relationships, was central to the artistic identities of the Beaver Hall women. For virtually all the male artists, including the aforementioned Thurston Topham, involvement with the generally inchoate and publicly low-profile group was largely irrelevant to the networking that had to be done within all-important social and professional infrastructures in order to establish their status as professional artists. Apropos the importance that several of the Beaver Hall women placed on the idea of friendship, Anne Savage, who in the early 1920s had been very active in Beaver Hall exhibition projects, approved personally Nora McCullough's selection of the 10 women artists who were included in her 1966 landmark exhibition. This was despite the fact that that half of those women had not participated, in fact, in any Beaver Hall exhibitions that we know of. They had, however, been friends, usually very close friends, of those who had taken part in the events. There was a remarkable spirit, Savage recalled, about her relation with other female members of the Beaver Hall group. We telephoned each other. Have you got anything? What are you doing? Can I come up and see it? Can you come down? Also significant to a friendship-based definition of Beaver Hall women is the fact that although the last of the group's known exhibition projects was held in 1922, the name survived for 2 more years in 2 editions of Montreal's City Directory and Telephone Book. From at least mid-1922 to mid-1923, the building at 305 Beaver Hall Hill was identified as the directory of the home as the home of the Beaver Hall group of artists. And here I show you a painting by Prudence Heward of someone who was frankly a close friend of hers, Mabel Lockerbie. Then, in 1923-24, the building was listed as the home of what was called the Beaver Hall Studios. The group thus continued up on until 1924 as a ring of mostly female friends. Randolph Houghton, who had maintained a studio at 305 Beaver Hall Hill, was the only male artist who seems to have been involved in the group at this point. It was not, in other words, an institution that was active in terms of public self-presentation. Bonds of friendship were reinforced by the fact that the clear majority of the women who had been linked with Beaver Hall group had similar backgrounds. Almost all were financially secure members of Anglo-Montreal society, and most had previously studied under William Brimner at the Art Association. Incidentally, though, the fact that some publications, among them Dennis Reed's very good, concise history of Canadian painting, state that all of the Beaver Hall members had studied with Brimner, and this is an indicator of how much the group has come to be defined lately on the basis of characteristics that were not, in fact, shared by all the members associated, but in fact with the core group of women. There are then solid and productive reasons to discuss Beaver Hall in terms both of its overall membership going beyond the lists of artists who participated in its shows, and especially of the women artists in particular. Indeed, these two phenomena are closely related. But there are also real disadvantages to the gendering of Beaver Hall, and ironically enough, one of the casualties may be feminist scholarship itself. On the one hand, the mutual friendship that embraced many of the women did not necessarily exclude all of their male colleagues. To assign motives of friendship exclusively to the women members risks obscuring something important, especially given the importance of both Jackson and Holgate as friends and active supporters of most of the members. In addition, however, the selection of certain artists as being of particular interest and the benign sidelining of others that follows on from this has characterized all Beaver Hall publishing scholarship to date. I hasten to say that in saying this, I am not in any way attempting to belittle that scholarship's many important contributions to knowledge. They've been very, very important, especially as regards the women artists on whom little or no earlier research had ever been done. However, as this conference's keynote speaker argued with regard to her research on Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun, and as I have contended in my own writing on the 20th century artist Laura Knight, singling out certain artists for biographical study while ignoring others risks removing the chosen artists from the complex social context in which they were defined, and instead presents them as entirely unified subjects around which everything and everyone else revolves. This is certainly not to deny that some artists make work that is more multifaceted and more visually rewarding than that of other artists. It is, however, to acknowledge the danger we unleash on our understanding of the past when we ignore things like the informal and non-hierarchical nature of women's involvement in Beaver Hall. Focusing on the few women who are well documented or whose work seems to resonate well with contemporary concerns, and thinking about the group as a whole in terms that are germane only to some of its female artists, risks setting up expectations about which individual artists are most representative and therefore most important. Surely this is something that militates against the ties of friendship that were so important to the Beaver Hall women, and that offers an alternative to the talent sweepstakes approach that does little to question art history's traditional assumptions and methodological structures. A focus on individual biography was key to the earlier feminist project of identifying hitherto neglected artists who could be slotted into the art historical canon, although this in itself is methodologically problematic and for obvious reasons. But it also carries the power to present a distorted picture of the relationship between the biographical subject and the friends and the social context that surround her. Reliance on a biographical approach that infers the existence of major heroines risks reiterating the methods, hierarchies, and biases that contributed to women being all too often written out of art history in the first place. If one is to build upon the important work of the scholars who published groundbreaking texts on Beaver Hall from 1966 through 2005, it is now necessary to combine the study of selected artist members with an ever broader and more theoretically complex analysis that takes into consideration the lives and careers of all the members of the group, men and women, famous and unknown alike. In so doing, we can probe the commonalities, contradictions, and complexities of how these artists individually and collectively supported, contested, and shaped the socioeconomic context that defined the discursive reality of the production and consumption of visual culture in Montreal. In 1925, Newton McTavish discussed women artists in a single, dedicated, but ultimately ghettoizing chapter in his book, The Fine Arts in Canada. That approach needs today to be an example against which future scholarship on the Beaver Hall group can define itself. Thank you.